day after that was the 24th of April, which is the day before Anzac Day, and Rob and I actually had to hop on the bus to get there. We left at, well, the bus left at 8:30, and I think we got there at like 8:40, so the bus waited for us, which was very nice of it. And then we basically just had to drive, well, we didn't drive, we rode on the bus to the Gallipoli Peninsula, and I think we got there about 4 or 5 at night, after going through, well, there were just massive queues of bus because there were just so many people coming to that, the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gallipoli. And yeah, we were really tired and really, well, I suppose tired's the word for it at this point. And they dropped us off at a place called Gallipoli, which, it was the spot where the Anzac troops were supposed to land during the Battle of Gallipoli. But I didn't actually recognise it as such at the time. I heard the name, and I was like, that sounds familiar. But I couldn't quite place why, and I figured, well, it probably sounds familiar to me because people have said at some point that this, Gallipoli is the place where you're going to be dropped off. I didn't actually get any photos of Gallipoli, and I wish I would have, because it was a nice open place. I mean, it was forested, but the forest kind of gradually sloped up to the hills. And it's completely different from Anzac Cove, which is where the Anzac troops did actually land, which is basically almost at the bottom of a cliff. And yes, it was a very different thing. So we wandered from Gallipoli up to Anzac Cove, which is about 3 kilometres walk from memory. And, well, the whole time getting there, I was actually kind of just very sad, for want of a better word. Like, I just kept thinking that a lot of people died, like, here, and they were really just let down by, like, all of the people who were supposed to be in charge of them in society. Like, well, firstly, all the diplomats and, politicians failed, because the First World War was completely and utterly avoidable, and a lot of people were just kind of too proud to stop it, and because of that, a lot of these soldiers had to die. And then also in this particular instance, they'd also been let down by their officers who had dropped them in the wrong spot, or really the Navy dropped them in the wrong spot, but the naval officers dropped them in the wrong spot. The officers in command of the Anzac troops, they just didn't, well, especially on the first day, they just weren't there to deal with the changing situation, which meant that the soldiers on the ground actually didn't really know what to do. Like, they had been dropped kind of 3 or 4 kilometres from where they were supposed to be, and they weren't sure whether the best option was to, head south to try and get to where they were supposed to start the attack, or try and make their way to the objectives despite the fact that there were now cliffs and mountains in the way, or were they just supposed to hold their ground and try and defend where they were. And there weren't any senior officers there to actually communicate with them to explain how the plan should change based on what had happened. And of course, this was the first major opposed naval invasion in history, so they hadn't bothered to work out, alternate or contingency plans, or just explain to the soldiers what the basic idea was that they were supposed to be trying to carry out. And a lot of people died. Anyway, then we kind of got to North Beach, which was another beach that the Anzacs landed at, a bit nicer, but still not great. And we were kind of waiting there. Well, we're not kind of waiting, we had to wait there until the dawn service started. I think we arrived there at about 7:30 at night, and the dawn service was about 5 o'clock the next day. And we'd been told that there'd been standing room only, and when we arrived there wasn't, so we were sitting, and then a bunch of Australians came and lay down around us and slept, so we're going to go, okay, they'll get up and move when more people arrived. But they didn't. Even though people came and told them that, there's a queue of 3,000 people and we need you to at least sit up, they just went, But anyway. So I stopped being sad overnight and more got angry at Australians around me. Overnight was actually kind of cool though. I was just sitting around watching documentaries more than anything. There were some good singers and performances. Actually, one thing about this whole Anzac Day thing is it actually made me realise that I really don't like Australians. Well, that's harsh. Their culture is a lot different to New Zealanders, and I prefer New Zealand culture greatly to Australian culture. Especially the dawn service was very Australian, and it didn't really appeal to me that much. Tony Abbott's speech in particular at the dawn service was bad. It was all about how wonderful the Australian soldiers were and how it was so great that they were going to go fight ISIS, the modern generation of Australian soldiers, which just isn't what Anzac Day is about for me as a New Zealander. But, like in 2008 as well as in Australia for Anzac Day, it became clear to me that, in New Zealand, Anzac Day is about remembering the dead, and it's kind of about mourning of all the soldiers that died so pointlessly. In Australia, it's more about how great their military is and how they should basically just conquer everybody because Australia is wonderful. And the dawn service was far too much like the Australian version of Anzac Day for me to be really happy with it. But, yeah. So after that, we kind of had to wander up to the New Zealand service, which was at Chunuk Bair. And it was a really good walk. I found it really good. Kind of just wandered up the Sari Bair Ridge up from Lone Pine to Chunuk Bair, which kind of went through a lot of the major points on the Anzac Cove battlefield. The path that we followed actually basically went behind the Turkish front lines. So I've got a couple of photos here of the Turkish trenches and kind of some dugout bunkers that they hid from artillery shells in. And we basically followed the front line up, started at Lone Pine, which is kind of the major Australian memorial there, where they fought a pretty massive battle. The first kind of point I found that was interesting was Quinn's Post, which was a point on the Sari Bair Ridge where the New Zealanders captured it on the first day, and it was the only point on top of this ridgeline that was held by the Anzac forces throughout the battle. I should also mention that, just for a bit of context, the Sari Bair Ridge is the highest point on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and basically the point of the landings was to capture this ridgeline, because once we were on top of it, we would then be able to essentially fire down at the Turks, able to dominate the peninsula, and because of that, the Turks wouldn't be able to get supplies to the fortresses at the southern end, which meant that the battleships of the Royal Navy would then be able to pass through the straits, advance on Istanbul, and essentially force the Ottoman Empire to surrender, at which point we'd then be able to get arms and weapons through to the Russians, and they'd be able to actually fight the Germans more effectively, and the war would have been over a lot sooner. If it's all kind of depended on capturing the Sari Bair Ridge. And Quinn's Post is the one point of the ridge where we actually managed to hold it. The downside of that was that, it was basically surrounded on three sides by Turks, and the Turks fired very effectively. It was basically cut off during daylight, and they had to supply it by night. And if you read about Quinn's Post in particular, you'll hear about lots of soldiers who have essentially committed suicide by wandering out of the post during daylight to, say, go to the toilet or anything like that, because they know that the Turks are about 15 metres away with machine guns, and they're not going to survive that very much longer. So kind of up there we wandered up to a place called Baby 700, which was kind of the centre point of the first day of the battle. During the first day of the landings at Gallipoli, there was a lot of confusion about what to do, especially on the part of the Anzac soldiers, and they kind of all gravitated towards Baby 700 just because of the nature of the terrain. And it was actually a very important point on the Sari Bair Ridge, and that it's kind of the first point where if they held at the top of Baby 700, they'd essentially be able to fire down the south towards the ridge, towards Quinn's Post and Lone Pine, and essentially be able to drive the Turks off of that part of the ridge. And the ridge dipped down from there before it started heading back up to Chunuk Bair. So it was actually a very good staging post towards attacking Chunuk Bair, which was the second highest point on the ridgeline. But the Turks managed to hold it during the day, mainly because Mustafa Kemal kind of ordered his troops over from the other side of the peninsula and arrived there in time to essentially stall the ad hoc Anzac forces attack coming off of the beach in the opposite direction. And because of the nature of the Anzac forces attacking, they were really attacking kind of as squads or platoons, which meant that when Ataturk, or not Ataturk, he was later Ataturk, at the time it was Mustafa Kemal, showed up with a full-strength battalion, they were essentially able to eliminate the advancing Australian and New Zealand forces kind of in a piecemeal battle. So it turned out that the Anzac forces never really got on top of Baby 700, and they never did for the whole battle, and it was always kind of sitting above the Anzac positions at Quinn's Post and further down in the valleys behind it, and was really kind of a central point in keeping the Anzac forces contained in the little valley they were in towards the beach. The next kind of major point on the line is Chunuk Bair itself, which is the second highest point on the ridgeline, and it was a central feature in the August offensive that the Anzac forces did. It was a major attempt to kind of break out of the little pocket they were in and capture this ridgeline. And then, as I said, once they captured the ridgeline, basically the Gallipoli Peninsula was theirs, and once they had the Gallipoli Peninsula, they could then just advance and just take Istanbul. Well, not really take it, but bombard it so that they would surrender. The August offensive kind of went wrong from the start, though. Basically, the plan was the New Zealanders were going to take Chunuk Bair, the Australians were going to man the current front line, and they were going to attack at Lone Pine and the Neck to just try and keep the Turks pinned down so they couldn't attack the New Zealanders. And there's going to be another brigade of Australians which was going to attack Hill Q, which is the highest point on the Sari Bair Peninsula, and on the way they were going to clear out this other ridgeline from machine guns, and because if they didn't clear out that ridgeline of machine guns, then those machine guns would be able to flank the New Zealanders as they attacked up Chunuk Bair. But unfortunately, those Australians didn't clear out the machine guns, which meant that the New Zealand attack stopped 500 metres short of the summit of Chunuk Bair. And it was really unfortunate because there was an attack by the Australians at the Neck, which was kind of reliant on the New Zealanders clearing Chunuk Bair. Unlike the New Zealanders that's kind of stopped when they saw that their supporting forces weren't in position, the Australians actually attacked while the New Zealanders weren't in position. And the Battle of the Neck is kind of famous just because of the slaughter. It only lasted about 10 minutes, but something like 400 odd Australians died for very little purpose. Anyway, the next night, after that, New Zealand decided that they should just try and take Chunuk Bair, even though there were machine guns flanking them. So they ordered the Auckland Battalion to attack Chunuk Bair. The Auckland Battalion was basically slaughtered in the same fashion that the Australians had been at the Neck. As I said, they had 500 metres of advance and machine guns shooting them in the front and the side. The Wellington Battalion was then ordered to attack, but Colonel Malone refused that order and said he would attack after dark, which the Wellington Battalion did, and they actually took the top of Chunuk Bair with very little loss because for some reason the Turks had actually abandoned it during the night. Most probably because it was under fire from British battleships. So the New Zealanders managed to gain the top of Chunuk Bair with no real casualties, but the problem then was that because those machine guns were still on their flank, they couldn't be resupplied during the day. Just anyone that tried was gunned down. So they had to sit up on top of the hill for that entire day fighting off Turkish counterattacks, and then they got resupplied at night and they had to fight off a second day. Just again the whole thing, fighting off attacks. They were also fighting off attacks during night, but the days were hard because they couldn't get any resupply. And then I believe a third day they also fought there. And then the Wellington Regiment Battalion were withdrawn and replaced by 2 British battalions, who I think managed to hold the top of that hill for about 45 minutes in the face of a massive Turkish counterattack, to be fair. And well, that was kind of the point where the Gallipoli campaign was actually lost, because as I said, if we held Chinook Bear, eventually we could have taken the whole ridge line, the Surrey Bear Ridge, and that was the point where the peninsula would have been lost. Like from the top of Chinook Bear, you can actually see the Narrows, which is kind of the point of what this whole campaign was about. It was the whole, if we can get our battleships through that piece of water, then Istanbul would essentially be defenceless. But it wasn't to be. So Chinook Bear, it's up where the New Zealand service was, which is way better than the Australian service. It had kind of the appropriate tone for Anzac Day, and everyone just kind of sat around singing songs, and yeah, it was really great. Yep. After that, we went back to Istanbul. Spent a long time waiting for our bus to come pick us up because there was just a massive queue of buses. We were on bus like 136 out of about 280 odd buses that had to pass through, and they didn't come in order. We were towards, I think about 2/3 of the buses had gone by the time we got picked up, and we got back to Istanbul after midnight, which was really unfortunate because public transport wasn't working anymore, so we had to walk back to our hostel. It was only half an hour, 40 minutes, but still I preferred not to have done it because we basically hadn't slept. I tried to get a bit of a sleep while waiting for the New Zealand service to start on Chinook Bear, but even then around lunchtime it was still probably only a degree or two, or say that it was probably 8 or 9 degrees, but after the wind chill people were saying it's down to about 1 degree, 0 degrees, and I just couldn't sleep in that cold, unfortunately. Well, I think I slept for about an hour and then just woke up because I was shivering. I hadn't slept at all over the night before, partly because there wasn't room to like sit or lie down, and partly because it was quite cold as well. Yeah,